Hi, welcome to Inventing Civilization, the YouTube channel that explores the history of political thought and philosophy. In this episode, we travel to ancient Greece to take a closer look at Plato. By the time of Plato's birth, the golden age of democratic Athens was coming to an end. Plato's childhood coincided with the final stages of the Peloponnesian Wars that saw Athens defeated by Sparta. Now this plunged the city into chaos as it lost its empire and, through a brief coup, its democracy. The resurrection of democracy in Athens was plagued by deteriorating standards of leadership, morality and law that culminated in the execution of Plato's beloved mentor Socrates when Plato was still a young man. Plato's world then was one of chaos. The Greek city-states were constantly at each other's throats, and Greek unity was an illusion. Now he would have been old enough as a child to remember the collapse of the glory of Athens, and by the time he was an old man, he would have recognized the rise of an entirely new empire, that of Philip of Macedon, whose son Alexander would change the world forever. In this context, it is no surprise that Plato held a negative view of Athenian democracy, but it would be unfair to dismiss him as a disgruntled pessimist. Plato identified some very real problems with democracy and asked questions that remain pertinent to this day. It's becoming a bit of a theme in this series that we don't know all that much about the philosophers themselves, and Plato is no exception. We actually don't even really know his name. Plato may or may not have been his nickname, and his real name may or may not have been Aristocles, and he may or may not have switched between the two later in his life, either on his own accord or by popular adoption. Now, this is a shame because fundamental information like the name or handle that may have been bestowed upon him by followers or that he may have chosen to go by would tell us something about the sort of person Plato was. But the main reason I'm telling you this is because it's as good an illustration as any of how little reliable information we have on him. Here's what we do know. Plato was born in 427 BC to parents who were both from old aristocratic Athenian families. Now this made him a free Athenian citizen, which was no small privilege. At some point in his late teens or early 20s, he joined the following of Socrates, an Athenian philosopher who preferred inquiry over doctrine, which was a novelty at the time. Plato held tremendous regard for Socrates. He made Socrates the main figure in most of his dialogues, and he adopted his passion for asking questions. The execution of Socrates seems to have had a profound impact on Plato, who seems to have spent considerable time away from Athens in the following dozen or so years. He is known to have traveled to the Greek colonies in southern Italy, where he met Pythagorean philosophers and the tyrant rulers Dionysius I and II of Syracuse in what is now Sicily. And these travels were the inspiration for several of his works. Upon his return to Athens, presumably in the 380s, he began teaching mathematics, philosophy and politics. In line with a Socratic heritage, his style of teaching was centered on discussions, and the academy Plato founded would grow to become a major center of research and intellectual exchange in the Greek world. It is where Plato appears to have spent the rest of his life teaching, researching and writing, right until his death in 367 BC. Plato was a versatile philosopher who didn't really turn his attention to the subject of politics until later in life. He explored this subject in three key works: the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws. Now, to understand where Plato was coming from in his assessment of political rule, we first need to understand the notion of eudaimonia, which you might translate as happiness. Now, most people, both in ancient Greece and in our modern world, would say that a happy life is one in which you are healthy, successful, and achieving things that you value. But Plato had a much more demanding view of what constitutes a happy life. To him, a happy life would come to those who strove to emulate, to the best of their abilities, divine virtues such as wisdom and courage and justice. Plato took this notion very far indeed. He thought virtue should become the central focal point of one's life. It required of people that they apply reasoning and inquiry to every aspect of their lives. It meant detaching themselves from everyday concerns and self-centered worries. It meant putting the greater good ahead of yourself. It even meant that death was a favorable option over compromising your values, a lesson that Plato had learned from Socrates. Now, to Plato, the existing forms of government were at odds with eudaimonia. Monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy had all fostered competitive individualism, power hunger, greed, the pursuit of narrow interests, and a general disregard for the common good. And this, plainly, would not do. So, Plato philosophized about an alternative form of government that would create a society based on eudaimonia. This naturally meant that those in charge should be people who dedicate their lives to virtue so that they can rule for the common good. In Plato's mind, there was only one class of people truly capable of benign rule: philosophers. It was philosophers who were masters of inquiry and analysis and who valued knowledge and wisdom over all else. It follows then that philosophers should become kings. He effectively argued that absolute power should be granted to perfect people, in his mind philosophers. Now, Plato realized that this was a utopian view, and he suggested more practical alternatives, such as selecting the more rational and intelligent among us and educating them on the subject of philosophy, so that they might become capable rulers. Now, this seems relatively benign, but in order to achieve this, Plato divided society into classes where the lower classes had no say whatsoever in how the state was run. Their role was simply to obey. Plato also has very little sympathy for the arts. Things like poetry and theater were dangerous in that they toyed with the emotions that might be counterproductive to moral development and eudaimonia. Plato's state, then, would be considered a totalitarian nightmare by most modern liberals. But it isn't his blueprint for a state that we should be most concerned with. Instead, his criticism of democracy is rather more pertinent altogether. Plato reveals his distaste for democracy by using a metaphor. So imagine a ship. The ship owner is the strongest man on board, but he, unfortunately, knows nothing about sailing. The sailors, meanwhile, are quarreling with each other on the proper course and are each trying to persuade the ship owner of the merits of their ideas so that they may become captain, although in truth none of them really possess the necessary training and skills for the job. The only one on board who actually possesses the knowledge to chart a proper course is the navigator, but nobody listens to him and he doesn't really have any leadership ambitions, so he doesn't participate in the endless power struggle. In Plato's metaphor, the ship owner are the citizens, the sailors the politicians, and the navigator the philosophers. To Plato, democracy was dangerous because leaders depended on popular favor, which meant they would go for short-term results and popular measures. They would avoid unpleasant truths and difficult long-term strategies, all to the detriment of the future of the state. As political factions try to implement measures that are beneficial to their own kind, they antagonize other factions, which leads to conflict. And as democracy descends into chaos, those who have the most to lose, the rich, rally around some kind of strong figurehead with populist solutions, enabling him to seize power, and democracy transcends, inevitably, according to Plato, into tyranny. Now, Plato didn't completely hate democracy. He thought, for example, that leadership needed some form of popular consent and participation. But he felt the system was doomed because the general populism of it all dragged gifted people down to the lowest level of shared understanding and marginalized the wise. This produced poor leaders who made poor decisions, which inevitably destroyed the state. Although Athenian democracy was a very different beast from modern democratic systems, a lot of Plato's criticism still applies, at least in part, to modern democracies. Which is why, to my mind, every aspiring political scientist or politician should read Plato's works even today, more than 2,000 years later. It's hard to overstate the legacy of Plato. He was the first Western philosopher who offered a reasoned critique of democracy and other forms of government. Now, while his blueprint for a state isn't something that many people would advocate we adopt today, Plato's arguments were very influential in the ancient world and particularly in the Roman Empire. His ideas were later overshadowed by those of Aristotle and Renaissance philosophers who considered Plato's views too authoritarian. But despite this, his criticism of democracy remains a solid reference point whenever we ponder the shortcomings of modern democratic societies. Beyond the field of political science, Plato was arguably the first thinker for whom philosophy was a field of study in its own right. He institutionalized it through his academy. To Plato, philosophy was a quest for the truth through relentless inquiry and argument. If you'd like to learn more about Plato, there's about 1 million different places where you could start, but for a more general introduction, I recommend Plato, a very short introduction by Julia Annas from 2003. It falls just short of 100 pages, so it's a nice and easy way to get started. Of a similar length is Richard M. Hare's Plato from 1982. Now, these two introductions offer somewhat varying accounts and place the emphasis on different aspects of Plato and his works, so they go well together. For the complete works of Plato, translated into English, I recommend the volume by John M. Cooper from 1997. It includes the 3 dialogues on the subjects of politics, the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws, as well as basically everything else Plato has ever written. If you'd like to take a shortcut straight to Plato's most renowned political work, the Republic, then you should consider the translation by Alan Bloom from 1968. Now, it's a very literal translation that tries to stay close to the essence of Plato, and some people like that, others don't, but it's an interesting work nonetheless. For the exact references to all these books, do please check the video description below. Well, I've said everything I wanted to say on Plato. I'd like to thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.